Riddle me this. How can the music industry be both in crisis and booming? Well, that's because there are several types of music industry. There's the big top end with all the big names that we know, like Coldplay and Take That and Adele and Oasis. They're all doing great. And then there's the other half of the music industry, the grassroots, the artists that you might know and love who sell maybe 10,000 records, who play maybe theatre size venues, which you'd think is quite a lot of tickets when you look around in the room, but they're not doing as well as they maybe once were. On the other hand, the music industry in the UK last year grew to 8 billion, not 8 million, 8 billion. That's how much it's worth to the UK economy. And at the same time, the threat of AI is here, and we're not necessarily seeing the action you would expect.
AI can do wonderful things, but when it comes to music and creativity, let's draw a line here, please.
More than 1,000 musicians are releasing a silent album to campaign against the British government's plans to change copyright laws, which could allow tech firms to train artificial intelligence models using real performers' voices. Artists including Annie Lennox, Kate Bush and Andrew Lloyd Webber back the campaign. The British government says the UK's current arrangements for copyright and AI are stopping creative industries from realising their full potential.
It's crazy to me that some of the biggest companies in the world, run and funded by some of the richest people on earth, are able to take music without the consent and consideration and permission of musicians. And you'd think that governments would step in, which is why an annual report like the UK Music one, where it talks about 220,000 people working in the music industry and how important those jobs are to the economy, should be ringing alarm bells. Not at YouTube and Apple, but at the UK government. They should be protecting us as workers, as people who live and breathe music, and not all of us are making very much money in doing so. And the risks right now are the biggest companies and the richest people on earth can just get away with doing whatever they want. Probably much worse than what pirating was doing to music, in my opinion. I get into that a little bit in this podcast, where I talk to the CEO of UK Music, Tom Kiehl. UK Music oversee like all of the recording side of the industry in the UK, and publishers and musicians. And yeah, Tom tells you exactly what they do at the start of this episode. We are on trying to empower you as music fans by doing an episode like this, which hopefully helps explain how well things are going, but also how complicated they are and how much needs to change. So this is the Drown Sound podcast, the UK Music annual report. It's out today on the day we release this podcast, which is the 12th of November, 2025. You can go read that and I'll pop that in the comments. Over to me talking to Tom. Bye. Our audience are primarily music fans and lots of musicians. So it'd be good just to get a quick overview of who you represent and how you manage some of the kind of conflicting elements of some of those representative bodies.
Well, UK Music is an organisation that was set up about 17 years ago, really in order to bring the music industry much more closer together, particularly in its relations with things like government and parliament. There's lots of issues that the music industry is facing, and obviously the policy process can really help us actually navigating that. So people like myself and other people working in organisations probably largely come from music industry background, music, a kind of more of a kind of policy background, but very deeply passionate about the music industry and wanting it to succeed. So we're the collective voice of the music industry. We have 10 member organisations, which range from people like PRS and PPL, the collecting societies, but also business organisations like the BPI, the Music Publishers Association, and AIM, the Association of Independent Music. But then 5 members are also kind of from the creator focus community, people like the Musicians Union, the Featured Artists Coalition, Music Managers Forum, the Music Producers Guild, and then the Ivers Academy. So 10 member organisations, all striving towards working for the best for the music industry. So we do things like advocacy, data, research, and some obviously we're only as good as we can be when we're united together. And as I say, there's lots of challenges that music industry is facing at the moment. So it can be quite a complex area to navigate because we represent both business and creator interests, but making sure that there is a coherent voice on some of these topics so that government and parliament can actually make sure we have the right processes, the right policies, the right steps in place to help the sector thrive is really important.
It's testament to how much you do that trying to work out what we could fit in this interview was what to prioritize. There's so many challenges facing the
Always
industry, but so
constant.
many areas that you cover.
Absolutely. So,
Um, the I looked a little bit into your background, and you were involved in setting up the Live Music Act. When you worked with the Liberal Democrats, is that right? Back in
yeah,
kind of
yeah.
your early parliamentary career.
Yeah. I worked for about 11 years in Parliament, which is coming out of university, a really great place to kind of cut your teeth. Someone who's very passionate about politics and the democratic process. So I worked in what was called a whip's office there. So it was all about kind of internal party management, making sure people voted the right way, making sure that the kind of information was kind of put forward. Not too dissimilar to UK music in certain ways, and it kind of, we are a bit like a whip's office. We kind of like we bring together the issues and try to find the way forward and get kind of people on the right path. So yeah, I spent 11 years there. Worked quite a lot on policy related issues to do with the creative industries, but in particular because I was such a very keen, passionate person about music, I developed something called the Live Music Bill, which then became an act during the coalition period of government, which is now quite some time ago. That basically deregulated live music performance from local authorities for small scale performances. So particularly, obviously, we hear a lot about venues and the challenges that they've faced, but that was a very early days an example of a piece of legislation which was designed to try and help venues, but also more wider music performance in whatever way it would be, trying to cut red tape from that. But I did a lot of work in kind of copyright related issues as well. So as a researcher for in a kind of political environment, things around what was called the kind of Digital Economy Act and Bill around 2009 and 2010, and that was obviously the era of peer-to-peer file sharing. Very these kind of concepts. You talk to people now, and people, what does peer-to-peer file sharing mean? But actually, that was a huge big debate, and actually probably one of the big reasons why UK music came about in the first place was navigating that early part of the internet period and kind of looking at the policy solutions that needed to be in place.
It felt like things changed so quickly, and I don't think we really like. I think you'd struggle to find many people that work in music that weren't downloading things or weren't sharing hard drives. But at the same time, we're also very aware that it was also their livelihoods that they were spreading around. And I think that, like, for me as a music fan, I wouldn't have been able to have become as, like, I'm from a working class background in Dorset. I didn't have access to huge sums of money. I worked in a record shop and I could buy a couple of records a week. And I think that there's a whole generation of people that now work in the industry that just were able to become more knowledgeable about music because of file sharing. And it is odd to think that, like, even now, like, things like Twitch, there's not really like music licensing, and you can stream music on there all day, and you can stream songs on Bandcamp without, and obviously the big topic that you've been campaigning on this year is AI and the kind of non-consensual use of copyrighted materials, and the ways in which these huge corporations backed by some of the richest people in the world think that it's okay to take music. And you've had people like Elton John and Dua Lipa and people kind of, and Paloma Faith at the Brits and all sorts of people get behind the campaign. I was trying to look at whereabouts it was at, because the consultancy was about 8 months ago, wasn't it? Like, are we any closer to musicians and record companies' rights being protected, and publishers and songwriters and everyone else whose work is being kind of hoovered up by these big machines to produce new works? Is there any update?
Well, I think one of the you brightly highlight, a lot of these issues, there's a lot of similarities, but actually, as you say, in terms of like peer-to-peer file sharing, then kind of move to the cloud and kind of these kind of wider, the way streaming's developed, and now with AI, almost like there's an evolution, but a lot of the kind of basic themes and challenges about respecting artists, respecting creators, respecting business who invest in them, they are fundamentally at the core of a lot of the kind of arguments that we put forward. And a lot of it is about getting a fair deal out of the technological companies, the kind of the people coming into the industry and wanting to use the content of our members. But in terms of, you're absolutely right. Well, there was a lot of concern at the beginning of the year, which has remained the case, around artificial intelligence and potential plans for the government to legislate and actually strip out elements of the copyright framework and make it, which will effectively make it harder to license and make it harder for people to enforce their rights, and the respect that kind of goes into that. That was part of a government consultation earlier this year, and in particular proposals that we found very concerning from a music industry perspective. So there was a debate on a bill.
I think the term that was being used was they were pro-innovation, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's quite right. Yeah, I mean, this is the balance. I mean, we kind of want to get the balance right. I mean, we want to be very pro AI and supportive of AI and technological developments, but at the same time, you need to respect industries like UK music industry, but other sectors, copyright, but who actually depend on this framework. So in terms of an update, I mean, there was a bill before Parliament as well, which the consultation ended in February, and then there was a bill in Parliament where actually was nothing to do with these issues, but some very creative, dare I say, members of the House of Lords, people like Baroness Kidron, Biban Kidron, and who's a crossbench peer, but also a coalition of other supportive peers, then backed amendments to actually put in place things like greater transparency from AI companies. That actually got to a bit of a constitutional standoff between the House of Commons and House of Lords. In the end, the House of Commons got its way as a democratically elected house. So that was very interesting, but it kind of has kind of created this kind of maybe slightly further delay in the process. So the government has not actually come back with a kind of outcome in terms of its consultation. Hasn't said exactly whether it still plans to legislate in this area. Has had several meetings with people like UK Music and some of our members, but also the tech sector, trying to sort of reset the conversation between tech and the creative industries, trying to see if there's a way through, and whether consensus can be met. I think that remains to be seen whether that will be the case. I think we're approaching it in a kind of considered way, but I think ultimately in December, the government is required to come back to Parliament at least and say what it is going to be doing on this policy area. So if it hasn't done by December, then I think the government's going to be a bit of trouble if it isn't actually saying exactly the direction of travel that it is intended to take.
Because it must be difficult. Like, I know that you're also on what sounds like a band, the Soft Power Council. So you're involved with some of the export side of the industry. Yeah. And like, I saw that Suno wrote to the Trump, I'm not going to say regime, what were they called?
Administration.
The Trump government, the administration. And the access to power that some of these kind of tech billionaires, like people like Peter Thiel, have to kind of go in and speak at the highest levels. I mean, obviously, hopefully, you being able to talk to someone like Nick Clegg, who's quite involved in all of that, is probably helpful for the music industry. And I think as someone who filled in that consultation, I think it was about 7,000 other people that did it, wasn't there? I think that was the number that was out there.
I think quite a lot. Yes, tens of thousands, I believe. Yeah, I think the end result.
Oh, okay. It just feels like we live in an age where these kind of big, like, I think Harold Cadwallader calls them the broligarchs, the bro oligarchs, and it must be difficult, even though the music industry is as big as it is, when you've got Elton John having to kind of go on Laura Kunsberg to advocate for artists, and you've got some of the biggest names in music and McFly talking up for the rights of artists. And also I really like McFly, and I love the fact that he's got such a big career as a child's author as well, which is doubly as copyrights being kind of encroached upon. And I think it feels like the tech's moved so quickly. A lot of the training might have been done already, and like, do you think that the government have really taken the urgency? Because like, in a way, like, copyright is a human right and it's also a worker's right, and it feels quite an odd thing that you're having to encourage the government to kind of come on side to back this. Has that been the case kind of like across parties, or is it kind of just like the internal government? Like, I'm just curious. You probably can't talk about it, because I know as a lobbyist you kind of things you can and can't say.
No, I mean, it's really interesting, because I mean, what you've kind of had actually is we're actually having a slight replaying of a debate we had with the previous government too. So basically in 2022, similarly, the previous government, the Conservative government, kind of brought forward relatively similar proposals to what the current government proposed. And eventually they kind of run out of time. The general election happened. They did sort of try to, but we have kind of unfortunately seen some of the similar sort of mistakes that maybe the previous government took. So you could say, well, is this about the party government, or is this about wider about the way government operates, and particularly on these issues? And but what I would say is that the current government has brought in something called a sector plan for the creative industries and the music. They've basically said there's something called a music growth package. So there is firm commitments about the music industry there. But I think one of the really big areas which I think the current government will be tested on is about how they deal with this particular issue. Because on the one hand, you have everyone all governments across the world are wanting to have the kind of edge on AI, and they want to have that market share, but they don't necessarily fully understand what that means. And for a country like the UK, where the music industry, the creative industries, those, as you said, soft power, where we do our cultural identity comes from people like the people like the Smiths and the Beatles and Joy Division.
Maybe not the Smiths anymore.
Maybe not.
Yeah.
Maybe from the period.
Yeah.
But yeah, but these
maybe to the Johnny. Maybe Johnny. We can send Johnny Marr out anywhere.
Indeed, but it's our cultural identity, and it is. If you go across the world, people understand sport, football. They understand music as being kind of very distinctly British and in the UK. So it's almost like, really, does the government really want to gamble against that when we have such a huge asset as the music industry and our wider creative industries? And actually, it should be kind of really powering and prioritizing the sector. It's actually really interesting. Recently, we've seen the Australian government have a bit of a debate about these issues, and maybe going along similar proposals and suggesting changes to copyright. In the end, they've decided not to go further. So it shows actually countries are a little bit more. Some countries are being more standing up to kind of the tech bros arguments that maybe have been the case before. I think actually, if you had this argument about maybe 10 years ago, it would have been much actually harder for us, actually, because I think tech bros and the tech sector was seen much more shiny. I think the public perception has changed somewhat, and I think on copyright issues, which can be seen as quite technical and quite hard to maybe engage the public, on this particular issue, we've seen really the public really very much get behind it, and in a way that I've never quite seen on any of the other IP issues before. That might be about the wider the kind of human element of AI and AI policy and that fairness, but also I think, as you say, like using very powerful voices like Paul McCartney and Elton John, who are actually very concerned about the future talent, because if you don't have put the kind of protections in place, our ability to develop future talent in the future will be considerably weaker as a result.
I guess there's a graph that I've shared a few times, and I'll drop it in the show notes and I'll put it on screen for people watching on YouTube, of just like how complicated copyright in the music industry is. I think it was shared by Steve Albini. It was just this, it was kind of like a flow chart of a song and like where the money goes. And even some of it, I was like, hang on a minute, I've worked in music for 25 years and I don't even understand some of these little bits in here of people collecting money. And I can see why from the outside the industry is complex and complicated with conflicting ownerships. But I think on the AI issue, the thing that, like, if everyone is a creator now with their own social platform, their own photos, their own text, their own identity being out there, I think it's easier for them to understand that what they've published on these platforms can be used. And I think that the age that we're living through of essentially people working for free for tech platforms who then sell advertising against your human expression, I think that's possibly, it's like, I don't know if we've hit the Icarus moment yet of flying into the sun, but the tech companies feel like they've reached a kind of boiling point where there's not as much love and trust. Like when you've got Elon Musk running Twitter and speaking at far right rallies, it's harder to say that these people are on your side and this is human endeavor and technology moving forwards. But one of the good things that has happened in the past year is the voluntary grassroots levy of £1 on stadium and arena tickets. Sorry, I realised that was quite a big pivot.
That's right.
But I think that it really shows a willingness to understand I guess like trickle down economics. Like there's lots of money being made at the top end of the industry, and the grassroots of the industry and the future of the industry, and the independent side of the industry, which isn't being bathed in money like the very top. I guess it's like 0.01% of artists. I think at one point it fell at the top 1%, but I think it's an even smaller percentage when there's 120,000 songs coming out every day. Something like 80% of artists release music and don't really make any money from it, and like there's a bigger group there that are struggling. And obviously we've seen venue closures, and we've seen artists cancelling tours for economic reasons as much as kind of health reasons, because if you stretch yourself too thin, at some point the burnout is going to catch up on you. And I think there's a combination of issues. I guess the voluntary nature of the levy has meant that not all organizations are backing it, or corporations, I guess, not even organizations, is it? It's like what do you think, how do you think it's gone so far, and like what do you hope the next steps are with the levy?
I think it's a really positive moment, as you say, like bringing things together, actually maybe learning things from other sectors, again, like bringing football and things like that. There's a great trickle down effect, I think, that exists, partly probably to do with the broadcasting rights that maybe exist with football and sports governance, but also I think people are generally concerned about the future in terms of actually, so it's with AI, in terms of like developing artists for the future, but also making sure they have the right venues, being a recording studios, being able to tour financially as well. These are all big challenges that kind of exist across the sector in a number of ways. So I think it's been a very positive moment. You kind of had that shift of people actually saying, well, and actually maybe looking at other countries too. And I think it's not unheard of in European countries to kind of have that kind of element of the bigger players supporting the kind of the smaller grassroots, whether they are venues, artists, whatever. So I do see that as shifting. I mean, I think we've got to monitor this closely to make sure that it is getting in the amount of money that is required that is genuinely needed. And I think the government has been very interested in this area too, which can only be a good thing because it focuses minds of the bigger players, but also shows a degree of commitment from them to supporting the sustainability of the future talent. As I said slightly earlier, there is a music growth package as part of, which is 30 million over 3 years, which the government has also committed to doing too. So it'd be interesting to see how those conversations about the grassroots levy kind of go in tandem with those conversations too, and making sure that kind of the whole of the sector benefits from the kind of fiscal interventions that we're maybe seeing now develop, and making sure that the industry can be properly sustained. As I said, we've recently released a new report which shows that the music industry is worth now 8 billion to economy, growth of 5%, and exports continuing to grow. 5% is great, and a lot of the sectors in the economy are not necessarily growing at that same rate. However, we did experience a kind of post-pandemic boom of kind of double-digit growth for previous years. So and maybe we got to assess whether like the kind of slightly smaller growth that we experienced this year is sign of a kind of maybe a change in shift, or whether that's a kind of a slight aberration. So I think we are definitely poised to capitalize on that, but I think it's something we're continuing to work out.
Because I think percentage growths are often like, they're great as a summary, but sometimes the longer term trends are often the thing that's worth looking at. Like the fact that the music industry is still growing, like I think is a really good thing, because I know that most of the artists, like the artists I manage, the people I work with, artists I do consultancy sessions with, it definitely doesn't feel like, speaking to them, like the industry is growing. So I think that knowing that people feel like their jobs are precarious, but you were saying the number of jobs in the industry has gone up as well. Like, I don't know, did you say it was 220,000?
Now 220,000. This is like full-time equivalent roles that across the sector, whether that's in live sector, recorded, collecting societies, publishing, musicians, performers. So it's the way we kind of process it with our kind of research partners is we kind of calculate that. Again, that has actually grown by 2%, so relatively smaller growth than the before. I think before, like previous year's figure was 216,000. So And again, yeah, it's kind of been at that level for a few years relatively.
And I guess the levy kind of shows that, like, yes, there's this everything's doing well at the top end, and like, how do we address things further down the food chain? Because and I guess for me, like, one of the things I've been talking about on this podcast for most of this year is kind of looking ahead. Drowning Sound just turned 25, and we've been looking ahead to 2050 to think about what do we need to do over the next 25 years to kind of shift the industry to make it sustainable, thriving, like, and ensure that, like, British music, as much as music, the industry globally, is sustainable. And I think that some of the topics that have come up quite a few times is people talking about the need for community. We were at the Youth Music Awards, and they were talking kind of about having a kind of collective strategy as an industry to really drive things home. And obviously, as UK Music, that's something that you do all the time. And maybe to think about how the Grassroots has its own kind of way of representing its kind of way it works in the world, and, as you said, education, and being able to fund and invest in the next generation. It's all feels like a big challenge. And one of the questions I've been asking people is, if you suddenly were given £500,000 right now, what bit of infrastructure would you build, or what's something that you'd improve, or what's a problem that, like, would you just literally just hire lawyers to take on AI companies? Like, how would you suddenly spend if you received that big sum of money?
I mean, that's a nice position to be in, to have that amount of money. I would probably make sure that it went on space and rehearsals, like venues, rehearsal space.
Sorry, I meant to say $500 million, not $500,000.
$500 million. Sorry, I thought $500,000. Gosh, half a billion. If we could have all the top litigators in the land, I'm sure we'd have a great burgeoning music licensed sector regarding AI. So that would help. But we don't want to litigate. Instinctively, you want to be in a situation where the law should be such where the policy process, particularly from an advocacy point of view, you kind of like don't want to get things to get to the point where you're having to go to courts, etc. It should be kind of done on the policy process itself. So, but yeah, I do think rehearsal spaces are something that needs to be looked at and supported, and something that
there's a real lack of them. From one of the artists I work with, we spent a while trying to find something for an upcoming show, and it's like, whoa, and it's like, and they're not, you find them and they're not very well resourced, or like you spend as long setting up as you do with anything
and
else.
You do have lots of like empty spaces.
It's small but big thing.
Yeah, there are lots of empty spaces out there, because either people are using offices less, or just kind of like high street closures. So it's kind of like there's potential there to that does take obviously a degree of willingness from local authorities, a degree of willingness from kind of people on the ground to really get those things going. But in theory, there should be potential there, I think, to get more spaces, to get the kind of young people who have a talent to harness that, to get to practice, and then get to the point where they can then be going to venues or going to recording studios. And I think that is in some ways a slightly untapped and less spoken about challenge. And like you say, the Youth Music Awards, I think, is a great testimony to that. Some of the work that they do within youth provision, and really making sure that those opportunities, particularly in harder to reach communities, people who don't necessarily have those opportunities to get them and to access music, and that music can be a great enabler for people to take a different path, whatever that may be. And so we really need to find opportunities to deliver that.
I was so lucky. The guy that ran the local venue, I think I said, can I build you a website because you don't have one, when I was like 16, which led to me becoming the in-house DJ and promoter, and being kind of mentored in like how things work, and whilst also working in the local record shop. And I think that those people are hard to find.
Absolutely.
And when I started a label, I had people like Tony Wilson calling me up and going, he called me up to try and find out more about grime one day, which was kind of surreal. Anyway, mentorship is something that I think is really crucial to ensure the next generation, and like the collective wisdom of the industry is often feels like it's in a profit-driven circles doesn't feel as kind of open and shared. So it's one of the reasons why I've kind of created this space with the podcast. And I think that, like, in terms of the infrastructure, the industry, obviously I'm biased because I've come from a media platform building background and building communities online. And like, it seems to me one of the big holes that we've got, especially in live music, is you go back to when the indie sleaze boom was happening and the Kaiser Chiefs and all these bands were taking off. We had The Fly available free in every Grassroots venue. We had about 10 magazines in every shop. We had various different people starting websites and online spaces where people were dedicating their time and energy to supporting, discovering, and kind of sharing their infectious passion for new music. And when I've looked into all the different funding that's out there, if you were a young TikToker right now or YouTuber and you wanted to talk about music, there's a bit of a hole there to, like, you could become your local scene's advocate on a local and or national scale. And I think that we're missing out on kind of how we help those people, which benefits, if they build an audience, that benefits all the artists they're talking about. And I think there's a little bit of a gap in, like, I've seen Justin Hawkins from The Darkness talk about how he can't play music on his YouTube channel, which is great in a way that the copyright restrictions are working, but he's got a really good audience and he's trying to talk about music he likes. And that inability to be able to share it, like, it feels like the penalizing kind of individuals versus the big corporations. Like, it always strikes me as being quite odd that Twitch can be owned by Amazon and you can run a DJ set on there for 3 hours and not pay a single royalty, as far as I understand. I'm sure they probably pay something in, but as soon as you want to play a piece of, like, I've seen people have their videos taken down on YouTube because in the background of a Vox Pop, there's some music playing in a shopping center or something. And it's like, suddenly they're demonetized. And, like, anyway, that's a slight aside, but I just think, like, in terms of the infrastructure the industry has, it's really crucial we think about how we build those audiences. And
yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think you hit on a really good point as well about, it's in many ways, in some ways it's never been easier in theory, the mechanisms there to get your music out there or to make an impact within industry in whatever kind of way. But the challenge is, particularly, I guess, in things like you're competing against everything that's kind of been there as well in the past. And so that's a kind of slightly challenging situation to be through. How do you actually get that cut through? And like you say, like, that kind of early noughties period, I'm just kind of thinking back to my youth when I was first going to gigs and venues. Grew up in Portsmouth Wedgwood Rooms, and it was actually we didn't necessarily have that many, like, bands coming out of the area and kind of really breaking through, but you kind of had a very much a vibrant music scene within the area, within 2 or 3, 4 venues, particularly in that areas, and particularly that link to the kind of university and the campus element of it too. And the world has changed, and I don't mean that in a kind of like let's move on and kind of let's forget about, but I guess it's about how you adapt in a way that you can kind of make sure that what made something special in the past and what made it really, really work, applying that in the kind of new kind of setting too. And I think, again, like, support for managers, support for people who kind of, like, really kind of trying to push things on a local level. Again, that's something that maybe doesn't get talked about enough in the same way, again, like sort of things like Rehearsal brews maybe don't as well. And I think getting that very passionate about local music industry. We did this report earlier this year called Hometown Glory, which is kind of looking at the kind of local elements to music and what you can do in a local level. As I said, when I was at Sixth Form College, I did a project about why Portsmouth didn't have that thriving music scene. It's always been a kind of constant thought around my head about why do certain areas have scenes and able to develop and why don't. And I think really what we're trying to do with that report is to kind of set the building blocks in process, and basically saying a lot of you do have potential assets. Well, it's just about realizing it and making the opportunity, and particularly that maybe partnership, working with authorities who maybe have that power to help develop that local talent in whatever way that may be.
I used to love going to Wedgwood Rooms. I grew up in Weymouth, so
Brilliant.
as soon as one of my friends could drive, I I think most memorably, I saw Muse play there, but I also saw Less Than Jake, who had a
Okay.
fire breather on stage, which was
Yeah.
quite fun. And
Well, I remember
it's a great little venue though.
Oasis did like one of their very like the kind of 1994 tour around yeah, where they basically just before they released Supersonic or just after they did their kind of early show around then. And I think it was like famous for two things. Firstly, that it was the first one where Liam wore a Man United, Man City top on stage, and secondly, I think it was a famously, I think Oasis were booked into a hotel where the band who were performing at the Portsmouth Guildhall were also performing that night, who happened to be E17, which obviously was a bit of an unholy meeting of personality types. I understand.
The history. So in amongst the various things that are happening in the industry, obviously with your new report, you're
Yeah.
seeing the success and like how music's performing globally. There's been a few conversations around having a music export office, and I know like the BPI have the MEGS funding. I've forgotten what MEGS stands for, even though the Anchoress received it and it was really helpful funding. It's a music export growth scheme.
Yeah.
I got it.
Yeah. Very good.
um, do you see that, like whenever I go to conferences, which I know like is a weird thing to do, so like a lot of music conferences, there's the talks during the day and then there's the events in the evening. And like when I went to Eurosonic, like I met someone who represents Ukrainian music and they were like, here are 3 acts we think you'll like out of the 15 that are playing. And like I met someone from the Nordics years ago, and I ended up going to a few of their festivals and seeing their local artists playing at Oya Festival and events like that. And Iceland Airways, like the Icelandic, I don't think Anna Hilda was ever officially the export office, but she did feel like it, and she invited me there, and which meant I got to discover artists like Oliver Arnold's really early on. And when British artists go out to South by or perform at Eurosonic or any of these events, there's not the same like collective, like there's not like an export person whose job it is to kind of go, oh, you're from Rolling Stone, do you want to come see this artist perform? And I know that export offices do a lot more than that, but like I've always felt as Drowned in Sounds, like we try to represent British and Irish music to ensure that more people know how much great stuff there is coming from here. And it's always been a sort of unofficial like form of nationalism, I guess, or national pride. I'm just curious whether you think that there's a strong argument for an export office and whether it's something that's just being talked about or something that might actually be a reality.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's something I think in particular there was a bit of momentum in the just after the Brexit settlement in 2020, 2021, when that took place. In particular, there was some very strong conversations with government about an export office and what that may look like, and whether that could maybe plug some of the gaps that have been faced there. I think in the end that didn't quite come to fruition, partly because again you had maybe a challenge about a government who brought in Brexit and then accepting that there were some problems with it, and the kind of didn't want to necessarily be saying it there was a problem there in quite the way that we were articulating. But I think we do look at MV in many ways in terms of a lot of the rest of the world, in terms of some of the support structures that they have in place. And actually one of the big things that's come out of both the report that we recently launched, but also something that we've been talking about for a little while, is about just how increasingly globally competitive the music industry is at the moment. And you've obviously, K-pop is very well known, but beyond things that in South Korea, obviously other aspects of Southeast Asian music is getting some traction. Canada is investing, Australia is investing in the music industry. Even places like Saudi are putting a lot of emphasis on. So we have to be kind of cognizant about the kind of broader landscape that we're now operating within, and making sure that we've got the kind of right protections in place in terms of the infrastructure. And we do have the Department for Business and Trade, and I think it's important that they do great work in terms of supporting either things like MEGS and supporting things like South by Southwest. But I think we can do more, and I actually have seen regional approaches to export offices too. I think actually there are 2 in the north of England now, or in the early stages. You've got Greater Manchester and also Liverpool and the wider north, I think, of developing export support processes. So, and actually I think what you've seen more generally within the way the political framework of our country is going, you are actually seeing more powers being devolved to a kind of much wider regional conglomeration, whether it's around city regions. I think that, again, that's something that's been happening for about the last 7 or 8 years. But it's interesting to see that mayors like Andy Burnham in Liverpool, mayors like Steve Rotherham Andy Burnham in Manchester and Steve Rotherham in Liverpool. It's interesting to see that they are recognising what they can maybe do at a local level for supporting the creative industries, but also in particular things like music. So I do feel that there's a slightly shift going on, and it's just making sure that we as the music industry are part of that shift too.
I thought it was interesting that I think Co-op Live, maybe just before or just after the Royal Albert Hall announced that they were joining the Levy as a venue, and like that money would then go into grassroots music in Manchester. It feels like, I know in Bristol they've been trying to do something similar with the kind of bigger shows, funding the kind of grassroots. And I think, yeah, Andy Burnham seems to be really leading the way up there with some of the initiatives. Like, I think I saw that he was doing something with BBC Radio Manchester where he was like picking a track of the week from like the demo file, and I'm sure that's someone in his office that's tasked with finding a few things he might
he's
like.
very big. He is a very big music fan. So
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised if, but
Yeah.
he knows how to kind of play that into and his identity as a politician, but also I guess he knows his constituency and just how much they value their own music industry in Greater Manchester.
Hi there, it's Emma here. I'm gatecrashing the podcast to quickly tell you about the Drowned in Sound newsletter. Every Wednesday, I invite myself into your inbox, with permission, of course, to share opinion writing and resources, tell you about cool things that you should be involved in within the world of music, activism, etc. I also bring track of the week and a little bit of hopeful news for you, because we all know that the news cycle can be grim at the best of times. Drowned in Sound newsletter every Wednesday in your inbox. Sign up now.
So I feel like there's a billion other things that we could talk about, but I think one of the other topics which has come up quite a lot is around a ticket regulator, because like consumer rights is obviously a big thing, but doesn't quite cover what's the kind of, I guess, the corporate power of ticketing, like with increasing monopolies of some of the biggest players in the market. Like we saw what happened with the Oasis tickets that led to even Victoria Derbyshire writing a piece about how confusing dynamic ticketing was.
Yeah.
Like, of course there was demand for the show. It was the first, it seemed like a very odd thing to impose in an unexpected way onto consumers. And like, I've been looking at, for instance, Marilyn Manson's on tour this week, and which was quite a surprise to see he was playing quite big arenas. And he is supporting the Grassroots Levy, but there was also like a £3.50 like restoration fund on top of all of the tickets at Wembley, and it's like I don't really even know what that does and who that goes to. And then you've got booking fees and like a print at home ticket fee and all these other kind of fees involved, which, like, as someone that works with artists, you go in and you do the kind of finalizing the kind of income of a show, and a lot of that money is not there. And obviously all the secondary ticketing stuff is separate, and VIP ticketing I think is a whole other world that I've never really kind of experienced. But do you think that there's a stronger argument for a regulator or something to oversee ticketing? Because it does feel a bit like the Wild West compared to football tickets or compared to train tickets or plane tickets. It seems odd that a concert ticket would be treated so differently.
Yeah, well, there is a government again, similar to the AI issue. The government did do a consultation on some of these issues earlier in 2025, and in particular, they looked at this whole issue of secondary ticketing and the kind of cap. that may be put in place to make sure that people aren't paying over inflated prices if there is a resale market. But there are other issues. I think the Oasis situation did show the kind of need for greater information at the end of the day for music fans in terms of the kind of especially if you're trying to get a particularly highly anticipated show and trying to get tickets for that, and just the sheer demand. And actually, I think it was a bit of a wake up call in terms of that. I mean, the thing is, again, you're dealing with often with things like ticketing, you're dealing with maybe sometimes companies who operate in North America, and there's this different cultural way, maybe the way you kind of like purchase tickets for events. And so kind of moving those kind of those models to the UK, and maybe we're as you British people maybe slightly less used to that. I don't know if we want a whole big ticket regulator, because there are very good organisations like Star, which is essentially a bit like UK Music but for the ticketing industry, who do lots of good work across the both music but other forms of events and theatre and things like that. And there are complexities to it, but I think certainly in terms of looking at a push to actually change the rules and laws around secondary ticketing and resale, that's definitely something which UK Music's very much supportive of the efforts around that, and making sure that relationship with fans. At the end of the day, music industry relies on a strong positive relationship with music fans, and that's incredibly important. And people don't deserve to either feel or be ripped off, and to make sure that we kind of make sure that the both good actors are operating, but also there's transparency is really key.
I guess related to that, like I helped push out the Music Fans Voice survey earlier this year, which was really powerful, and even Danny Dyer got involved to encourage his followers to take part, and like about 7,000 people took part. And on a recent podcast, Kevin Brennan talked with one of the people that ran the FSA about the kind of the Culture, Media and Sport Committee's commission fan-led review of live and electronic music. And it seems increasingly like you listed all the bodies you represent, but none of them represent music fans. There's not a collective voice for music fans in the industry. And is that something that you've seen in other countries, or that you think that's like the most I've seen is things like K-pop for Planet and like these different fan groups with specific issues? But do you think there's maybe examples, like I think like, you know, as you mentioned in football, the podcast with Kevin Brennan, they talked a lot about what we can learn from the fan-led grassroots review of football. I think it's do you think there's scope there or space there?
Potentially, yeah. I mean, I guess the challenge is that in the same, but not the same, a band or an artist is a football club or making those parallels. But I guess a lot of the way, and people like genres, they're a particular fan of a type of genre. I guess it's like everyone likes music, is finding a way to kind of harness that in a kind of broad in this broader sense. Because I guess people's often their entry point is through either a scene, a type of music, a type of band, artist, whatever. So I think that's probably the challenge, is trying to make it kind of coherent. And as you say, the K-pop maybe thing is an example, because it's maybe people who particularly like K-pop, or but I don't see any reason why you couldn't get that kind of mass movement to scale. And I think, as you say, like the fan-led review and the fan voice survey earlier this year just kind of show that kind of enthusiasm and ultimately really, yes, none of our bodies are dedicated to the music fan, but I hope, and I speak for all of them, I'm sure I do, and that all of them
are music fans.
Yeah, they're all music fans, and we want music fans to feel part of the industry and part of what the output is.
Which I guess leads to my next question, was how can music fans do more to help some of the work that you're doing in the organisations you represent? Because I think a lot of fans, like, you can write to your MP obviously about different issues, but it feels like when it's done collectively, like around the AI issue, for instance, it felt like a lot of audiences of those artists kind of created some noise around it as well, which I think is quite powerful. Is that what can music fans do to be helpful?
I mean, definitely. I mean, I think, I it sounds glib in a way to say write to your local MP or things like that, but actually these things I think we've seen that with the AI issue. If you can get something to become a post-bag issue, as they kind of effectively what it's called in parliamentary circles, if you can get making MPs are going to, even if they're not particularly interested in the issues, they're going to feel, well, this is actually something I'm going to have a position on, or this is something that actually may mean things to the community that I represent. And actually, at the end of the day, there might be votes in it for me, cynically. So I think we are a campaigning organisation, particularly with, for example, the AI stuff earlier in the year. We did put out materials, encourage people, whether they're music fans or worked within the industry, how to maybe write a letter in a particular way, the kind of the particular points to highlight. So I think that using our kind of social media feeds, but also our website, we always put, whenever we're doing that kind of mass campaign type work, we'll kind of put it out there. I think and the problem is, the challenge is, and kind of link back to one of your earlier questions, sometimes the policy process can be quite slow, unfortunately, and it can get bogged down with things. So I think not to lose faith in terms of the fact that it sometimes is a grinding task, and getting it. As I said, one of my early successes in my career was the Live Music Act. It took about 2 or 3 attempts to get that through Parliament. We had 1 or 2 goes at it first, and then eventually it kind of got there. It does sometimes take that.
Was that like an 18-month process or something?
Yeah, it can do, and I think that's the government levers machines sometimes can be quite slow, but also in terms of building up a campaign so that actually has that kind of head of steam and the kind of support behind it. You've got there's no, in some ways, you don't want to necessarily peak too soon with something like that too, but I would say, if you're passionate about the music industry, you want to ensure that your favorite artists, performers still are able to create good and amazing music, and also you want the UK to be pushing boundaries in the future in a way that it has done for the last 50, 60, 70 years. The best way is to actually, in terms of working with someone like UK Music, is to make sure your voice is heard. And also, we're always welcome to ideas as well, if in terms of particular issues that maybe people are facing, whether you're working directly within the industry. We've obviously got our member organisations who give us lots of ideas, and we work with them collectively. But sometimes there may be some things that we're less well aware of, in particular way things are going on. So also see us as a vehicle and means to actually saying, well, this issue is going on in my local community regarding music, or I'm facing this particular challenge. Is there something UK Music is doing anything about that?
Well, I guess finally, like you touched on it earlier, your annual reports just come out by the time this podcast is released.
Yeah.
What are the big stories in music this past year, and is there any leave us on a hopeful message of where we're headed?
Big challenges are actually in terms of actually breaking new artists. I mean, we always we report, our annual report comes out in 2025, but in terms of the data lag, we're always reporting on data from the previous year. So the report we just recently published is about 2024. 2024 was actually a challenging year, I think, in terms of commercial success in actually breaking through new UK talent in kind of maybe the way before. So I think the kind of underlying story is that if we are having a potential slowdown of growth, is that to do with maybe not quite having the right mechanism in place to really fulfill that potential there. And I guess the AI issue, there's some really strong survey data around perception of the industry to do with artificial intelligence. Again, the continued challenges around European Union touring and Brexit, and the further issues around that. So I think a lot of we're producing it in time for the autumn budget as well, which comes at the end of November, and to making sure in those kind of couple of weeks we've got a really strong message going into that autumn budget. So when the government looks at what they may do next, and thinks about things like the nighttime economy, is that something that it could kind of get behind, or other areas too. So it's a strong story. It still shows an amazing music industry we have in the UK, but with some underlying maybe challenges that if we continue to ignore, we risk the potential of the success of the industry in the future too.
And does it help that we've got a prime minister that played music famously with Fatboy Slim at one point back when they were youngsters. Is that helpful? It seems like there are people that are music fans, and we had some quite high profile news stories of them going off to get to see Taylor Swift and all sorts of big artists. Like, is it helpful? Do we think we've got a government that understands the soft power of music? Obviously that's something that you're representing with the council that you're on, and like, do they get it?
Yeah, I think it's definitely helpful having a prime minister with the background that he has. He recently did this piece for Radio 3, essentially about his own passion for music and his own background with music. So I think it can only be a good thing. But I would say across all parties, there are powerful advocates. We run something called the All Party Parliamentary Group that brings together people from Labour, Conservatives, Lib Dem, Green, etc., Plaid Cymru, SNP, making sure that there's a very broad coalition of support. And I think it's the thing is with politics is not, especially on advocacy points, is not to put all your eggs in one basket too, and to make sure that you have those both from the backbenchers within government side, but also across the piece, making sure that you have that kind of powerful voice talking about the importance of music. I think everyone likes music in some way. I've never met one politician who doesn't like music. I think the challenge we have is getting people to take it seriously as a proper industry, a means for making outcomes, making the world a better place, and actually making sure that the underlying infrastructure, the policy framework, the finance behind it is sufficient for us to actually continue to realize one of our best assets. And I think that's my underlying message to the community, political community, that is on that.
That feels like the mic drop ending. Well, there was a lot in there, and I hope that you've learned something and maybe feel a bit better that someone who is a music fan, who has been in politics and understands how the political system works, is out there representing the artists and music that we love. I would say that you should go have a proper look at their report. There's some good quotes in there and things, and there's a lot more data than we really had chance to get into in this conversation. I think that UK music are doing quite a lot that maybe would benefit from a lot more fans making a bit more noise about it, and probably a few more artists in positions of power using their pedestal to talk about the industry that they are part of. And maybe they're all right, but maybe not everyone else is. And I think it's amazing that we've seen Chapel Roan and Ray and other artists use their speeches at big award shows to speak up for some of the things that need to change. And I hope that more artists will do that in 2026. If you want to keep up to date with what's going on in the industry, the Drown in Sound newsletter, which you can sign up to at drowninsound.org, does touch on some of these things alongside our music recommendations and reports from cool gigs and events we've been to, and interviews with artists that we think are very special and that you should spend some time with their music, because time is precious. And on that note, I've been Sean Adams. This podcast has been produced by Josh Craggs. And if you are not already, please hit subscribe. You've been you, I've been me. I'll see you next time. Bye for now.